Fascinating, isn't it? How the mind deceives us into believing that others have fundamentally transformed when, in truth, it's merely our perception dancing to the rhythm of recent memories. You think they've changed, but your brain's playing tricks on you, weaving elaborate narratives from the thinnest threads of recent interactions while conveniently forgetting the rich tapestry of who they've always been. I've spent considerable time observing this peculiar human tendency, this mental sleight of hand that transforms familiar souls into strangers with each passing encounter. We are, it seems, remarkably susceptible to what psychologists call the recency effect. Our brain's stubborn insistence on weighing recent experiences far more heavily than the accumulated wisdom of years past. It's rather like judging a symphony based solely on its final notes, ignoring the magnificent orchestration that preceded them. Consider this. Your partner of 15 years snaps at you during breakfast, and suddenly you're convinced they've become irritable and difficult. Your best friend cancels plans twice in a row, and you begin to wonder if they've grown distant and unreliable. Your colleague offers unexpected praise, and you start believing they've finally recognized your worth. In each instance, your mind performs this remarkable alchemy, transmuting isolated incidents into sweeping character assessments. The truth, however, is far more nuanced and infinitely more interesting. What we perceive as fundamental change in others is often nothing more than our brain's primitive attempt to make sense of complex human behavior through the lens of immediate experience. We are, in essence, constantly rewriting the stories of those around us, each new chapter threatening to eclipse everything that came before. This cognitive quirk isn't merely an interesting psychological phenomenon. It's the silent architect of relationship destruction, the invisible hand that builds walls between hearts that once beat in harmony. It's the reason why couples who've weathered decades together suddenly feel like strangers, why lifelong friendships crumble over trivial misunderstandings, why families fracture along fault lines of misperception. But here's where it becomes truly fascinating. This same mental mechanism that can destroy relationships can also blind us to genuine transformation. While we're busy convincing ourselves that others have changed based on fleeting moments, we might simultaneously overlook authentic growth, real evolution, meaningful shifts in character that deserve our attention and acknowledgement. The recency effect operates like a tyrannical editor, ruthlessly cutting the rich complexity of human experience down to bite-sized, digestible narratives. It's efficient, certainly, but efficiency in understanding human nature is often the enemy of accuracy. We trade depth for speed, nuance for simplicity, and in doing so, we lose something essential about the people we claim to know and love. What makes this particularly insidious is its invisibility. Unlike other cognitive biases that announce themselves with fanfare, the recency effect works in shadows, quietly reshaping our perceptions without our conscious awareness. We don't realize we're doing it. We simply find ourselves genuinely believing that this person before us has somehow morphed into someone entirely different, when what's actually changed is the weight our memory assigns to their recent actions. Today, we'll journey together through the labyrinthine corridors of memory and perception, exploring how this mental trickery operates, why it evolved, and most importantly, how we can recognize it before it sabotages our most cherished relationships. We'll discover that the very mechanism designed to help us survive in an unpredictable world has become, in our modern context, a threat to the connections that give life meaning. Through stories both heartbreaking and hopeful, we'll uncover the profound impact of recency bias on our daily interactions. We'll learn practical strategies for seeing past the illusion, for recognizing the difference between genuine change and perceptual distortion. And perhaps most crucially, we'll explore how understanding this phenomenon can deepen our empathy, strengthen our relationships, and free us from the exhausting cycle of constantly reassessing those we love based on their most recent performance. The mind, you see, is both our greatest asset and our most cunning adversary. Learning to outwit its tricks isn't just about better relationships. It's about reclaiming our capacity for genuine intimacy in a world that seems increasingly determined to keep us isolated and suspicious. Let me tell you about Margaret, a woman I encountered during my years of observing human behavior in all its bewildering complexity. Margaret had been married to David for 28 years, and if you had asked her 5 years ago to describe him, she would have painted a portrait of a gentle, thoughtful man who remembered anniversaries, brought her coffee in bed, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense when she needed comfort without words. But when Margaret sat across from me, her face etched with confusion and hurt, she described a completely different man. "He's become so selfish," she said, her voice carrying the weight of perceived betrayal. "All he cares about is his retirement plans, his golf, his needs. I don't recognize the man I married." When I gently probed deeper, asking about specific incidents, the picture that emerged was fascinating in its revelation. 2 months prior, David had made a unilateral decision about their vacation destination, something he'd never done before. 3 weeks later, he'd forgotten to pick up her prescription from the pharmacy, leaving her without medication for the weekend. Just the previous week, he'd scheduled a golf game during what had traditionally been their Saturday morning coffee ritual. These 3 incidents, occurring in rapid succession after years of considerate behavior, had somehow rewritten Margaret's entire perception of her husband's character. What Margaret's mind had done was remarkable in its efficiency and devastating in its inaccuracy. The recency effect had seized upon these recent disappointments and used them as a lens through which to reinterpret not just David's current behavior, but retroactively color her memories of their entire relationship. Suddenly, his thoughtfulness seemed calculating, his gentleness appeared performative, his love felt conditional. But here's what made Margaret's story particularly poignant. David hadn't fundamentally changed at all. He was navigating the anxiety of approaching retirement, dealing with his own father's declining health, and struggling with a medication change that affected his memory, none of which he'd shared with Margaret because he didn't want to burden her. His recent behavior was indeed different, but it was situational, temporary, a response to circumstances rather than a revelation of his true character. The tragedy wasn't that David had become selfish. It was that Margaret's brain had convinced her that 28 years of evidence about his character should be discarded in favor of 8 weeks of atypical behavior. The recency effect had stolen her ability to see her husband clearly, replacing intimate knowledge with hasty judgment. I've witnessed this phenomenon countless times, each instance a small tragedy of misperception. There's the story of Jonathan, who became convinced his teenage daughter had transformed from a loving child into a hostile stranger, when in reality she was simply displaying the normal developmental behavior of adolescence, made more pronounced by recent academic stress. Jonathan's mind had taken her recent eye-rolling, short responses and bedroom-dwelling tendencies and crafted a narrative of fundamental personality change. Or consider the case of Patricia, who decided her lifelong friend had become fake and superficial after the friend seemed unusually upbeat and positive during their last few encounters. What Patricia didn't know was that her friend was actively practicing gratitude and optimism as part of therapy for depression. The recent fake cheerfulness was actually a sign of healing, but Patricia's recency-biased perception interpreted it as evidence of character deterioration. Perhaps most heartbreaking was the situation with elderly Walter, who became convinced that his son had grown cold and distant because recent visits had been brief and seemingly distracted. Walter's mind had transformed 35 years of devoted sonship into evidence of indifference, all because recent interactions had been colored by his son's overwhelming stress from a messy divorce and job loss. The recency effect had made Walter feel unloved precisely when his son needed his understanding most. Each of these stories reveals the same psychological pattern: our brains, designed for survival in environments where recent threats demanded immediate attention, continue to apply this same urgency to emotional and relational assessment. We evolved to notice if the usually peaceful neighboring tribe had recently become aggressive, but this same mechanism now causes us to believe our spouse has become unloving because they've been distracted by work pressures for the past month. The emotional stakes couldn't be higher. When we allow the recency effect to govern our perceptions of others, we don't just misunderstand them, we often withdraw our love, support, and understanding precisely when they might need it most. We create self-fulfilling prophecies where our changed behavior toward them, based on our misperceptions, actually causes them to change in response to our withdrawal. Understanding the recency effect isn't about making excuses for genuine problematic behavior or ignoring real relationship issues. It's about developing the wisdom to distinguish between authentic change that deserves our attention and temporary variations that require our patience. It's about reclaiming our ability to see the people we love with the full richness of our accumulated experience, rather than through the narrow window of recent events. The first step in overcoming the recency effect requires what I call temporal perspective, consciously expanding your time horizon when evaluating someone's behavior. When you find yourself thinking that someone has changed, resist the immediate urge to accept this assessment as fact. Instead, ask yourself, what evidence am I using to reach this conclusion, and what time frame am I considering? Create what I term a relationship inventory. This isn't a cold, clinical exercise, but rather a warm reminiscence of who this person has shown themselves to be over time. Think back 6 months, a year, 5 years. What patterns emerge when you consider their behavior across these longer periods? Often you'll discover that what seemed like fundamental change is actually a temporary deviation from their established character. The key is specificity. Don't just think they used to be nice. Instead, remember specific instances of their kindness, their generosity, their love. Recall the time they drove 3 hours to comfort you after your job loss, the way they always remember your mother's birthday, their habit of saving you the last piece of dessert. These specific memories serve as anchors, preventing your perception from drifting too far based on recent turbulence. Second, practice what psychologists call situational attribution, actively looking for external factors that might be influencing someone's behavior. Humans are remarkably consistent in their core personalities, but we're also highly responsive to circumstances. When someone seems different, become a detective of their current life situation. Are they facing unusual stress at work? Have there been changes in their health, their family situation, their financial circumstances? Are they dealing with seasonal depression, medication changes, or life transitions? This doesn't mean making excuses for inappropriate behavior, but rather recognizing that temporary behavioral changes often have temporary causes. The gentle husband who's become irritable might be dealing with chronic pain he hasn't mentioned. The usually punctual friend who's been running late might be managing a family crisis. The typically positive colleague who seems negative might be struggling with personal challenges. Third, implement what I call pattern interruption, actively challenging your recency-biased thoughts when they arise. When you catch yourself thinking, they've become so, stop and complete this sentence instead. Recently I've noticed, but historically they've been. This simple linguistic shift forces your brain to acknowledge both recent observations and historical patterns. For example, instead of "Margaret has become so demanding," Try recently. I've noticed Margaret making more requests, but historically she's been quite independent and considerate of others' time. This reframing doesn't invalidate your recent observations, but it contextualizes them within a broader understanding of who Margaret is. Fourth, practice direct communication before drawing conclusions. The recency effect thrives in the absence of information, filling gaps with assumptions based on limited recent data. When someone's behavior seems different, consider asking gentle, curious questions rather than making internal judgments. "I've noticed you seem stressed lately. Is everything okay?" often reveals context that completely changes your interpretation of their recent behavior. This approach serves multiple purposes. It provides you with more complete information, it demonstrates care and concern for the other person, and it prevents the kind of emotional withdrawal that can damage relationships based on misunderstandings. Remember, your goal isn't to be right about your perceptions, but to maintain connection and understanding. Fifth, develop what I call emotional archaeology, the practice of digging deeper into your own reactions when you perceive change in others. Sometimes what we interpret as change in them is actually change in us. Are you more sensitive lately due to your own stress? Have your expectations shifted due to recent experiences with other people? Are you projecting your own fears or insecurities onto their behavior? This self-reflection isn't about invalidating your observations, but about ensuring they're accurate. If you're going through a difficult period, you might be more likely to interpret neutral behaviors as negative or to notice negative behaviors while overlooking positive ones. Understanding your own emotional state helps you calibrate your perceptions more accurately. Sixth, create behavioral baselines for the important people in your life. Just as doctors establish baseline vital signs to detect meaningful changes in health, establishing behavioral baselines helps you distinguish between meaningful changes and normal variations. What does this person look like when they're stressed versus relaxed? How do they typically respond to criticism, disappointment, or excitement? What are their patterns around communication, affection, and support? Having these baselines allows you to interpret behavior more accurately. If someone who typically processes emotions internally suddenly becomes very expressive, that might indicate significant change worth exploring. If someone who usually responds to texts immediately takes longer to reply, but you know they're dealing with a major project at work, you can contextualize this delay appropriately. Finally, practice what I call generous interpretation. When someone's behavior could be interpreted multiple ways, consciously choose the interpretation that's most consistent with their historical character and most generous to their current circumstances. This isn't about being naive or ignoring red flags, but about giving people the benefit of the doubt when their recent behavior seems inconsistent with who they've shown themselves to be over time. If your usually thoughtful partner seems distracted and less attentive, generous interpretation might suggest they're overwhelmed rather than uncaring. If your typically reliable friend has been flaky lately, generous interpretation might consider that they're struggling with something rather than becoming irresponsible. This approach often leads to more accurate assessments and preserves relationships that might otherwise be damaged by premature negative conclusions. The recency effect, you see, isn't just a quirk of memory. It's a fundamental challenge to authentic relationship. When we allow recent experiences to override our accumulated knowledge of who someone is, we lose the depth and continuity that makes love possible. We begin treating the people closest to us like strangers, constantly reassessing their character based on their most recent performance. But here's what I've learned through years of observation. The people who maintain the strongest, most enduring relationships are those who've learned to see through the illusion of constant change. They understand that humans are remarkably consistent in their core nature, even as they navigate the constantly changing circumstances of life. They've developed the wisdom to distinguish between who someone is and how someone is feeling in the moment. This wisdom isn't just about being more patient or understanding, though it certainly leads to both. It's about recognizing that genuine intimacy requires the ability to hold space for the full complexity of another human being, including their temporary struggles, their circumstantial challenges, and their efforts to grow and change. When we fall prey to the recency effect, we lose this complexity, reducing rich, multifaceted individuals to flat characters defined by their latest actions. The antidote to the recency effect isn't perfect memory or supernatural perception, it's conscious intention. The intention to remember not just what someone did yesterday, but who they've been over years. The intention to look for context rather than accepting surface interpretations. The intention to maintain connection even when recent interactions have been difficult or disappointing. This intention transforms relationships. Instead of the exhausting cycle of constant reassessment and emotional withdrawal, you develop the stability that comes from seeing people clearly. Instead of the anxiety that comes from feeling like everyone around you is constantly changing in unpredictable ways, you develop the peace that comes from recognizing the fundamental consistency of human nature beneath its surface variations. Most importantly, when you stop falling prey to the recency effect in your perception of others, you model a different way of being seen. You demonstrate that it's possible to be known and loved for who you truly are, not just how you performed in your most recent interaction. You create space for others to have bad days, difficult periods, and human moments without losing your love or respect. The journey toward clearer perception isn't always comfortable. Sometimes, recognizing that your perception has been distorted by the recency effect means acknowledging that you've been unfair to someone you care about. It might mean apologizing for withdrawal or coldness based on misunderstanding. It might mean extending trust when recent experiences have made you cautious. But this discomfort is the price of authentic relationship. The alternative, living in a world where everyone around you seems to be constantly changing in unpredictable ways, is far more uncomfortable and infinitely more lonely. When you learn to see through the tricks your brain plays with recent memory, you reclaim your ability to truly know and be known by others. The recency effect will never disappear entirely. It's too deeply wired into our survival mechanisms. But awareness of its operation allows you to question its conclusions, to seek broader perspective, and to maintain the continuity of understanding that makes deep relationship possible. In a world that often seems designed to keep us suspicious and isolated, this skill becomes a radical act of love and connection. Remember Margaret and David, whose 28-year marriage nearly crumbled under the weight of 8 weeks of atypical behavior. When Margaret learned to recognize the recency effect in her own thinking, everything changed. She began to see David's recent behavior not as evidence of fundamental character change, but as a temporary response to temporary circumstances. Instead of withdrawing, she moved closer. Instead of assuming the worst, she asked questions. Instead of ending their story, she deepened it. Your relationships, whether with partners, friends, family members, or colleagues, deserve the same generous, clear-eyed attention. They deserve to be seen with the full richness of accumulated experience rather than through the narrow lens of recent events. Most importantly, the people you love deserve to be known for who they truly are, not just how they showed up in their most recent moment of struggle or stress. The next time you find yourself convinced that someone has changed, pause. Remember that your brain is remarkably susceptible to the recency effect, weighting recent experiences far more heavily than they deserve. Look deeper, think broader, and choose connection over conclusion. Your relationships and your own peace of mind will thank you for it. In a world of surface interactions and quick judgments, The ability to see people clearly across time isn't just a relationship skill, it's a profound act of love. Choose to love this way. Choose to see this way. Choose to remember that you think they've changed, but your brain's playing tricks on you.
If you believe this video might help someone dear to you, share it with them. A small gesture on your part could mean the world to a friend in need.